think, but I guess I'll also say what I think I would do better, what I think I'm doing better now
Mhm,
is just really recognizing how relational this work has to be. I
mhm,
actually think it's fairly easy for me at this point to like point out all of what's not working and be really angry. And I am. And that's fair. Like I think it's I just want to say anybody who's like, but I'm fucking mad and and I'm mad that the people around me aren't doing more. I'm mad that I'm not doing more, whatever. Totally, totally valid. But in some ways, I think that's somewhat easy and I
mhm.
think the harder thing
Yeah.
is to really ask questions of like, yeah, how do we stay in relationship when we're deeply disappointed with ourselves and each other? How do we stay in relationship when there's ongoing conflict and stress?
And I find it kind of funny, I find it kind of sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. I find it hard to tell you, I find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's a very, very mad world. Mad world.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And I am your ever-present host, Dean Walker, in this tiny little outpost in the interwebs called Living Resilience, and also the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And today I am thrilled to welcome Holly Truhlar to be one of, I think it's going to be a large number of people who will be doing interviews like this or panel discussions or both in this year-long program, Islands of Sanity in a Mad World. And Holly, thank goodness we got to speak a little while before turning on the recorder. And you have just been such an inspiration for me. I've learned so much, and I'm in such admiration ongoingly for the academics that you've taken on in your world over the years, the the various traditions that you appear to have brought into, and we were just talking about weaving our lives, strand by strand, and you've got quite a weave going on. And I should just mention that the most recent way that I was connected with you over time is with the something of a transition, perhaps a temporary transition for therapist and author and soul activist Francis Weller to step back for a while from his extraordinary ongoing schedule of leading grief rituals and doing his counseling and on and on. And to watch you and the other team members who are holding the space that Francis has offered up to y'all to hold, and then bringing your own flavors to it. It's just been exceptional. It was a beautiful, beautiful course, and I'm hard pressed to imagine a stronger skill set or set of skill sets than what you have and your other teammates in that, Francis Weller space, um, as you start to craft your own expressions and doing that together in different groupings of y'all. And of course, for anyone listening, I'm going to be putting whatever information Holly instructs about how to contact her or the other members that I'm talking about their work with primarily grief and soul work. And I know you'll tell us more about what's on offer. Um, you'll have plenty of access to those links, those offerings. And I was already telling you, Holly, that um, I'd like you to speak to 2 times. One time is really close to now, which is middle of August in 2024. And another time is going to be whenever I schedule in the emphasis on grief and soul work and so on in this year-long program. And that's going to be months away. So we got 2 things being delivered, and people will have to, just figure out what's already passed by and they've missed and what is still available. So, Holly, I'm going to really kind of take myself off the hook to try and introduce you. If you would not mind introducing yourself a little bit about what are the elements that, again, you've woven together over your life to date that added up to just being such a profound container for the kind of work that you're now doing. And then, of course, just perhaps you could then just slide into what is the work you're now doing. So, Holly, hi, welcome. It is so great to have you. And tell us about you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Dean. I want to say thank you for having me here. Thanks for the work you do. We were talking beforehand, and I was saying, like, I just see you continuing to show up in this work that's not easy.
Mhm.
You've been such a consistent, congruent person in this sphere. So a lot of people who hear this might not know this, but like, we know each other. We've been in the same room with each other. We've been through some weird, community projects together and stuff like that. Um, so it's always a delight to be with you, and I appreciate the invitation. And yeah, I'm so glad that you got to be a part of the recent grief ritual training, the 5-month grief ritual training we did with Francis.
Mhm.
Well, and I'll just name our team because it feels important. So as you said, Francis Weller, Aaron Giesemann Rapke, Carl Rapke, and Alexandre Jodan. So beautiful team. We are putting that course. It was a sort of live course. We're now making it into a pre-recorded static course. So that will be available whenever this comes out. That'll be available. So we can put information up about that. But yeah, I'm just deeply grateful to be here. And man, the question, like, who am I? What do I weave together? Oh, how did I end up here? I guess I'll start with maybe a little bit of boring stuff. I have a doctorate in law. I have a JD. I went to law school and graduated. And I also have a master's in transpersonal counseling psychology. And I just say that because there is this way in which my work really weaves together those two things. So I'm looking at different systems, including legal systems, political systems. I have a bachelor's in political science and environmental affairs. So I'm pretty system oriented. And
Mhm.
at the same time, I'm very soul oriented and sort of psychology oriented. So, within all of that, the where we're at as a planet and a species is really interesting to me, and it's really hard to miss collapse and polycrisis and metacrisis when you're kind of weaving all these things together and pattern tracking and watching systems. So I think that's enough about like maybe my formal education. I'm coming from. We were talking about earlier in our conversation, just like how sometimes people in both of our lives will be like, so what do you do? And I always joke, I'm like, you know, my law degree really helps people think I'm like a valid, person, which is just funny to me. Because I have to say, my master's degree was actually much harder for me to get. So, anyways, The other stuff that's important to me that I think has shaped me. I mean, one thing I'll say is I'm someone who has just been through a lot of pretty incredible loss. So I have two siblings who have died. My brother died when I was 10. My brother Brett, my sister Ivy died 5 years ago. Um, so that's really shaped me, shaped how how I show up in this world. I also was in a really severe accident. I was run over by a drunk driver in my 20s. So again, that's this other really initiatory, traumatic, griefful experience, along with other things. I think everybody at this point has experienced a certain amount of trauma. I think we're living in sort of this griefful field, but those were these really kind of cataclysmic, transformative, initiatory experiences that, in my eyes, really brought me into this work. And I think there are people who have been through really significant loss, who are, I think a lot of the people in collapse aware spaces have been through a bit more than maybe the average person. There's something that happens when you've been through your own experiences of trauma and loss and can kind of stay with that, where then you're a little bit more able, I think, to stay with the trouble. So just to say, that's a large part of what's shaped me. And then the other pieces, um, I'm how do I say this? I'm kind of a weird person and I and I really love interspecies communication. I really love donkeys. I really love the
Mm.
earth. I really love wildness, right? And so in that in those relationships and in that exploration and in that want to kind of feel into my aliveness, my wildness, it's also brought me to this place of collapse awareness, this place of what is true and what do we need to be doing right now. So I don't know. I think that answers some of your question. And I'm happy to talk more about um, what I'm currently doing or anything. I'm curious if there's anything that I missed that feels important. I know you had asked me when you invited me in this conversation, you had asked me about the essay I wrote 6 years ago or something like that, um, which, was also a bit of a cannonball into the collapse space or into a bunch of different spaces because that essay actually went like semi-viral and
Mhm.
it was pretty daunting actually. So I'm happy to talk about that too if wanted.
And would you name that essay for us? And I'll be sure to
Yeah.
link in it as in the show notes as well.
Yeah, so the name of the essay is Mainstream Psychology Can Go Fuck Itself. And I just as a side note, I actually that was my working title and I wrote that essay in like a day. I had been thinking about it for a long time. I would go on walks, I would think about these things, and then I just kind of wrote it down one day and that was my working title. I contacted a couple of my friends and I was like, should I even post this? Like, is this just me ranting? Um, and they were like, no, 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 just post it. So I put it on my website. I thought like 12 people would see it. I'm not like, I was like, oh, so I just used the working title because I was like, no, that is how I feel. And it hit some note, right?
Mhm.
And people really liked it and it took off and it was actually a really weird experience
Mhm.
because I had this experience of my sort of platform or visibility growing larger than what I was ready for or skilled for or experienced for in some ways.
Mhm.
That not that I was like a total newbie, but I certainly just wasn't I had a feeling that I wasn't totally ready for that much exposure, right? Like I
Yeah.
hadn't yet grown into it, which I think is true. Like knowing what I know now, I
Mhm.
didn't really have, I would say, the relational chops to totally back it. Just to say, um, it was an interesting experience and I still stand by that essay. That essay still makes its rounds. It's so funny. It'll like make these rounds in different circles. Like it went through Germany a couple years ago, and I just got all these German people like emailing me and asking to do, or like I think it went to Belgium at one point, and then there's all these. It's just so interesting how the internet works and to watch that happen. But that essay was really written from a pretty like deeply kind of like despairing, disappointed, and outraged place. As a psychologist, I was really looking at psychology and looking at some of my colleagues, therapists and such, and seeing how little there we were talking about in stage capitalism, how little we were talking about collapse seriously, how little we were talking about even just oppression and collaboration and what would be needed for that. And so that essay was really talking about all of that and telling people like, hey, we need to do better. If you're helping professional, you need to be doing better. And if you're somebody who's seeking out a therapist and you're collapseware and they're not weaving this in, like you got to find someone else. We got to find other people. And it, like I said, it just kind of hit this note. And honestly, for like a few years, that's like how a lot of people knew me. Like I would just show up in groups, even online groups, and people would be like, I know you. You wrote the mainstream psychology can go fuck itself essay. And I was like, yeah, that's true. So anyways, my body of work has expanded a bit more, thankfully. But I still stand by that. And honestly, whenever people ask me about it now, I always say if I was going to write it today, I would probably just take it further. I would probably just be more emphatic about, and
Right.
honestly, the essay could be titled Mainstream Just About Anything Can Go Fuck Itself. So
Right.
that's how
Well,
I feel.
maybe what you've just done is created the bridge that you were inviting me to ask you for. Uh, I can't imagine a more important bridge, and I love that essay. I love the edginess of it, the truthfulness of it, and I love your suggestion of you would just be more emphatic. So, how about if we just do that for a little while? We're going to be heading toward finding out about what you're offering now, what you're doing now, how does your work express out into the world? And but before we go there, I'd ask you to just lead us out, and I'm happy to just trail along with you best I can. I certainly have my own points of view about these topics, and they are barely containable rage at this point. It's there. I can touch into it, but I also know I've got to leave it a huge amount of it off to the side, unmetabolized, because it would take up a massive amount of my conscious energy virtually every day. But just assuming that we're all doing the best we can to co-regulate, to self-regulate, and to find a way to have a balanced experience of each day, remembering to touch in with the sacred and the depth of relationship that's possible and so on. Could you nudge us toward what would it sound like? What would you be bringing up if you were to just take it to the next level of emphasis of blank aspect of the business as usual culture can go fuck itself?
I mean, I think just the analysis of end capitalism, the violence of capitalism,
Mhm.
the violence that we're living in, and how much all of us are having to disassociate just to participate in that.
Yeah.
Um, it's like I had that analysis at the time, and now it's so much more like I'm just so much more sure of it. I'm
Mhm.
so much more aware of it. I also think looking both backwards and forwards and sort of saying like uh we need to be deeply honest about what our empire is built on, the
Mhm.
genocide, the violence, supremacy culture. Again, these were things I knew, but uh, and I said them pretty straightforward in some ways, but in other ways, I don't think I just don't think I took it far enough. So I think really recognizing that, and then and again, bringing it outward towards almost any field that's still sort of caught in this mainstream, analysis isn't quite the right word, but is still acting like we can function within a capitalist mindset, that
Mhm.
we could function in within infinite growth, or really any kind of growth model, right? That's not going to work. It's going to cause more suffering. Um, and then I I think, but I guess I'll also say what I think I would do better, what I think I'm doing better now
Mhm.
is just really recognizing how relational this work has to be. I
Mhm.
actually think it's fairly easy for me at this point to like point out all of what's not working and be really angry. And I am. And that's fair. Like I think I just want to say, anybody who's like, but I'm fucking mad, and and I'm mad that the people around me aren't doing more, or I'm mad that I'm not doing more, whatever. Totally, totally valid. But in some ways, I think that's somewhat easy. And I
Mhm.
think the harder thing
Yeah.
is to really ask questions of like, yeah, how do we stay in relationship when we're deeply disappointed with ourselves and each other? How do we stay in relationship when there's ongoing conflict and stress? How do we, I've been really interested lately around like the connection between lack of accountability systems and structures in our individual lives, in community. I work in a lot of different community groups and projects and things like that. And the amount of times that rupture, harm come up, and then there's very little kind of skill or ability
Mhm.
to address that in compassionate ways, right? So there's a lot of talk around like cancel culture or disposing of people, and that's a bigger discussion, but in some ways that's real, right? We live in a disposability culture. We live in a culture where people dispose of each other, and
Yeah.
it's not okay, right? That's real. But also what's happening is there's like very little in between how to address harm, like in a compassionate way, in a relational way. So it's like it either goes kind of just unrecognized, we all move on, or, right, people are canceled or whatever happens there. And I'm sharing all this because I'm really interested in the connection between these smaller ways that we don't know how to deal with accountability, and
Mhm.
this larger way that the planet is now holding us to account, and we don't know what to do about it.
Mhm.
And I think they're very connected. And I think until we can figure out these smaller ways, and I'm talking about different things like transformative justice and you know, working within community groups, feedback loops, these types of things, until we can figure that out, even on small scales, and we haven't figured it out. I'm telling you, I'm somebody who's in circles around this and works on this, and I've been in accountability processes in every role. I've been the person that's caused harm, I've been the person that's been a witness, and I've been the person that's been harmed, and I've also been sort of the facilitator. I've been in almost every role of this, and we don't fully know what we're doing. We're
Right.
trying, we're experimenting, and I feel like we could take that out into this larger picture and sort of be like, oh, so what does it mean for us as a species to start to be held accountable for causing really massive harm,
Mhm.
right? And what does it mean, like internally, to look at that and sit with that? So I suppose those are some ways I would take it further. And in some ways, it's like, um, I would be even more accountable to what's happened, right? And in other ways, I would probably be a bit softer because it's abundantly clear to me that we cannot have conversations about collapse or even about politics, or there's so many things. Um, in a fairly relational, in a fairly inviting, in a fairly curious way. And so that's the piece that's, I think, harder and takes more skill. And that's probably, if I were to write that essay, or often people actually be like, you should write a part two. And I'm like, I
Mhm.
don't know. I don't know if we need more of that. But I think it would be a lot more curious, and I think it would be a lot more like relational, right? Because what we're talking about is actually incredibly traumatic,
Mhm.
right? It's actually
Yeah.
incredibly scary. Yeah, like, and so to ask people to participate in that conversation while I or anybody is just kind of telling them how fucked up it is and that they need to get on board is ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's like a skillfulness that I'm hoping to bring in more.
Mhm.
But I'm curious, Dean, like I'm curious what you might add to that essay, or what you might add even in the last few months or years of
Yeah.
doing this work.
Yeah. Thank you. Um, I really appreciate your sobriety and your softness through these last few minutes. I'm moved. I'm actually moved right now by you are one of the most committed people I have ever met to that relationality that you keep bringing up. My system just loves that about you. I don't have to wonder what you're thinking or what judgments you have about me. I mean, you may have judgments about me, but what is predominant energetically all the time with you is you are a space. You are an invitation to relationship, whether that's uncomfortable in the moment, or it's beautiful in the moment, or it's joyful, or there's donkeys present, or so so just that is what I'm left with out of what you shared, and I thank you for that. And how I what I would add to what you've said is my experience of these past few months and past couple of years in particular is that there is a gravitas uh, that's just in the ambient field, like this is really happening now, and especially in this past, I don't know, 6 months, a year, with the introduction of the artificial intelligence, the AI conversation as a kind of a representative element of the acceleration and intensification of the entire tech bro reality, coding this business as usual self-terminating system. My experience is that we are on a threshold that will bring far larger, far more traumatic at scale elements than anything we've seen before. Like, some of the worst predictions for the past 10, 15 years, some of them actually writ large are showing up, and more, and things we couldn't have predicted. It's like, so I would just add that the nowness of it, like what's breathing down our neck, like really happening and really soon, if not now, uh, will make your kind of embedded challenge that you gave us in what you said, this, how can we stay relational? when we have this entire culture is founded on such egregious toxic elements that are really can be excruciating to really open up with one another. And yet I have no idea how else to do it when I hear your invitation. And then when I add to it these things that are present now on top of that foundation, the lack of truth telling to ourselves from our own media, our government, the corporations, and so on, all the evil players are yeah, extraordinarily powerful and toxic. And what they're delivering. I remember when there's a local, I call him a medicine man, but a powerful elder in this community here in Southern Oregon back when you produced this gorgeous conference
Mm.
before you left. And I think you know who I'm talking about, and he said he shared there and he shared in another meeting that I was in with him. This is a few years ago around the Dakota Access Pipeline. And
Mm.
he says, I'm rattled. And I'm telling you, this is a martial arts master and just one of the most powerful human beings I've ever met. And for him to talk about being rattled, um, it's extraordinary. It has me barely able to breathe just recounting it. So that's what I would add is the nowness on top of that foundation that you just described. And still the challenge or the invitation is still there that I heard you speak, which is how can we stay related? How can we deepen our relatedness in the face of these self-terminating stressors? This is extraordinary. This has never happened at scale on this planet ever. So that's what I would add.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And,
Yeah.
I think part of what I guess I want to say this, and I'm actually curious about your experience with this as someone who's been in the collapse aware space, been really facilitating in the collapse aware space. I often tell people this when I kind of started really facilitating, doing stuff, doing that conference, that was before the pandemic. That was, I really I was already leaning in that direction, but when I really was like, oh, I'm doing like collapse aware grief tending work, community building, this kind of stuff, was like right around 2016 for me.
Mhm.
So almost a decade. But at that time and up until the pandemic, a lot of my work, like the beginning of a lot of workshops, the beginning of a conference, would often be kind of explaining to people where we're at and trying to almost convince them, right? Like collapse is going to happen. And some people would be like, oh, yeah, totally. Right. Like some people would be like, yep, climate crisis, whatever. But there was like a good amount of people that you kind of had to like, I don't want to say convince, but in a way, like you'd be like, hey, here's sea levels. Hey, here's the IPCC report, like whatever. And honestly, people would come to some of my stuff and I always know that they had some feeling about it. They like wouldn't be around me if they didn't. But some of them would be like, oh, you're like the first person to ever name this, or just really jolted, right?
Mm, mm.
Just to say now, after the pandemic, I had an experience. I don't have to do that anymore. I don't have to convince
Right.
people collapse is happening anymore.
Yes.
Most people, right? Yeah, there's some fringe people that are sort of just still like everything's fine. But for the anybody that I would say is like centrist, left leaning at all, kind of, yeah, it gets that we're in collapse now of some sort. There's varying degrees of that. There's varying
Mm.
degrees. Some people are near term human extinction folks. Some people are sort of like, yeah, doesn't look good. Things need to change. But there's no more really having to convince people. Like, I don't even to be honest, I don't follow a whole lot of like numbers and graphs anymore. Not
Yeah.
that I don't believe them.
Yeah.
Because for me, I'm sort of like, yeah, no shit. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I see them sometimes. They'll come up in my feeds or people will talk in groups will talk to me about them. But it's just been an interesting shift. And in some ways, I appreciate it, right? Because for me, it's actually gotten a lot easier time trying to just get people to like believe the basic premise or believe we're at where we're at. So there's a way in which we can kind of like hit the ground running
Hmm.
that is much more easeful for me.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's still times where I'll say what I say. Maybe it's the way I say it, maybe it's the sort of with the oomph that I say it with that people are like, "Oh, wow." Right? But rarely are people like, "I don't know about that." Right? Which like when we first met, I think we were both kind of in doing the work we were doing, but really trying to like bring people aboard a lot more. That was my I don't know, I'm curious about your experience of all that cuz the pandemic absolutely changed how
Mhm.
I how I at least start workshops, how
Mhm.
I'm doing some of this work. I don't know, I'm curious your experience.
Wow. Yeah, there's less convincing to do. And I'm with you that I call it the fire hose to the face. The way too much content of all kinds, including the kinds that really matter. There's gorgeous stuff, and it's all becomes a fire hose because it's all so much. And so, yeah, I call it the sober data, the actual, IPCC stuff and climate change stuff and so on. And where my attention has gone to recently, like I have this 12-month course starting up called the Islands of Sanity in a Mad World, that it's really a focus on how do we expand our capacity to be present in the face of larger and larger stressors. That's the core theme of my work. It also could be called the inner work of collapse. So I just don't waste any time at all on convincing or, I've got plenty of easy, soft, gentle material to introduce people. Some of the pre-recorded introductory courses that are in my space and so on. That's great. And it's important for people to get the basics that way. But really where my attention is even in the collapse aware and collapse acceptant communities, my experience is that there's still, we're all still saturated in the business as usual world. And unless, in my experience, that, great if somebody has a different experience than I have, but mine is that this takes work to desaturate to any degree from the business as usual world that is self-terminating. And so to I'm just wary if somebody doesn't have an active set of practices that they've curated for themselves that goes right to what is it that you need in your system to be able to expand your capacity to actually be present in this world. Everybody's got to be doing some kind of practice about the lies, just multiple layers of lies that is the way our government speaks to us and the media and so on. We've known is a stack of lies, and they're just getting craftier and more intense through the use of propaganda and of course AI and so on. It's just weaponized. That's just one small example of if we're not desaturating about that and finding really significant truths in the world. Like, you and I have researched it enough over years that we've got our sources that we know we can trust, and we can go to it quickly, and we can, but if a person doesn't have that, damn, gotta find it. You gotta, get some good coaching and get some good sources, not to mention how to start to create circles of support, circles of the deep relatedness that you keep talking about. Trust is such a rare commodity. And without trust and without relatedness, without our own center that we can reclaim from this whirlwind of bullshit, we just don't stand a chance.
Yeah.
And that takes work. Each of those steps takes work. So how about if I just give it back to you? Do you have anything to kind of bounce off of what I'm saying here?
Yeah. I mean, I I agree with everything you're saying. And I just really want to name the level of like exhaustion, the level of loneliness, the level of emptiness, the level of confusion,
Mm-hmm.
the level of trauma that we're living in right now, right? The field of grief that we're living in right now. I think to really grok that, and again, for me, that's a piece of the relationality. So when I can really sit with that and be like, so everyone I'm talking to at this point is in a deeply confused field,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, Everyone we're talking to at this point is in crisis, maybe personal crisis, but certainly collective crisis, right? And so I think there's just a practice for me. The other thing I want to say is that process of waking up to the systems we're in, of waking up to collapse, is incredibly painful,
Yeah.
and there's something that happens. I consider myself a leftist, and I talk to a lot of leftists. And most of the people in my groups are anywhere from liberal to leftist. Um, but I consider myself a fairly radical leftist, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever I talk to other leftists, I'm always like, leftists have a intellectual superiority problem. And it's a real issue because this is my interpretation. I actually think we have a better grok on reality than a lot of other folk. That's why I'm a leftist.
Yeah.
Both historically and kind of what we think is going to happen, and even what we think needs to happen to get where we maybe want to be, right? But we have an intellectual superiority problem, and I have so little interest in that, right? It's actually like a form of supremacy.
Mm.
Um, and
Mm.
and I'm saying that to say, like, I just think to really think back on any of our own processes as we became more and more awake to what's happening, and
Mm-hmm.
to really get how scary that can be, is so important. I remember, like, when I was doing that conference you were talking about, so that I think was in 2017 or 18, one of the two. Maybe it was 2018, but one of the facilitators, her name's Tanur. She's a Black woman, amazing facilitator. Um, and we were talking about collapse awareness, anti-oppression work. This was kind of like behind the scenes. We're planning the conference. And I had said to her, I was kind of being like, not rude to her, but I was being kind of like flippant, talking about people in general. And I was like, yeah, for people that aren't collapse aware, like, welcome to the fucking party. Like, kind of saying it, like, And she just stopped me, but in a really kind but straightforward way. And she
Mhm.
was like, nah, Holly, but really, like, welcome them to the party. Like, what else are you gonna do? And I had this moment where I was like, if this Black woman who lives in the South, and has been through a lot more than me, can actually welcome people, including me, to the party as a white woman and do that relationally, like,
Yeah.
why the fuck can't I? And that's what we're going to need. Like, even if that's not how we feel called emotionally, which at this point it is how I feel in my heart, it's also just good strategy. Like, to really
Yep.
recognize that we're in this together. And as you said, these forces of violence, these predatory forces, which we could talk about the predator in general, we could talk about this from a soul perspective, really strong. And it is going to take a lot for us to face them. And by face them, I mean, if there's any chance of a livable future, that will have to happen. But also, if there's any chance of us dying as people, as a species, with integrity, with care,
Mhm.
right? It's going to take a lot. And a big piece of that is going to be us coming together. So even just strategically speaking,
Yeah.
like, yeah, let's welcome each other to the party. Let's work on the skills of building belonging. Because so much of this, in my mind, has a lot to do with not having belonging, with not
Mhm.
feeling that code of belonging with us, and not even really knowing the skills of that. Again, that kind of goes back to disposability culture
Mhm.
and all of those things. I
Mm.
work with a co-facilitator, Desiree Attaway, and one of our recent offerings we did, one of the first sessions, she said, no one gets left behind. And I just want to like be like, that is actually such a powerful statement.
Mhm.
And I'm talking about that as far as humans, I'm talking about that as far as other species, and I'm also talking about that even as far as our ancestors, right? So there's a piece here where part of what we're having to metabolize at this point is ancestral trauma, ancestral grief, right? And there's a lot of different ways people do this, but one of the bigger platforms around this is this way in which they talk about doing ancestral work. And they're like, we only work with well ancestors. And I just have to say, stop saying that. Not only is it ableist as fuck, but we actually can't afford to leave any of our ancestors behind. We actually can't afford to leave anyone behind. So we actually have to work with the most difficult parts of ourselves, the
Mhm.
most difficult parts of our lineages, the most difficult parts of our society. Now, I'm not saying that that means we have to go into loving conversation with everybody, right? But I am saying that there's a heck of a lot more people out there that we could build conversational bridges with, that we could build relationship with. And we actually have to do that. We actually have to do that if we want to, again, have any livable future, which might not be, I don't know, that it takes a lot of imagination to dream into that, which I'm a big fan of imagination. Um, but uh, I also think, like, even if we're just going to be like hospicing humanity,
Mhm.
we still need to do that together. I still think it's beneficial. I think there will be less suffering the more we're able to build these relationships with ourselves, with the earth, with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Really well said. There was a piece that came to me that I speak about a lot in my version of the work, and um, when you were, I'm just letting it sink in some of what you shared, like uh, the assertion that we leave no one behind, that expansive inclusion, and what showed up for me was this distinction that I've used since my teenage years is a liquid state. I think what it's come to be known in our culture, especially here in the States, is uncertainty. That uncertainty is the enemy of all of what we are about in the USA. You know, we don't want any uncertainty in the marketplace, and no uncertainty in terms of the direction of a corporation, the direction of a political party, and so on. And I was mentored quite a long time ago about instead of having this uncertainty be a villain, something to be avoided at all costs, something to be annihilated and cemented so that it can't get in, that kind of relationship with it. What if we created an allyship with it? And that's when I decided, because the uncertainty thing, I just couldn't relate to the word, and I got the dynamic, and it's fragile, and it's often like what cements it in is our judgment and othering other people and projecting those judgments, and that kind of weaponizes the desire to annihilate or forbid this uncertainty. So in calling it a liquid state, it's still uncomfortable as fuck. I won't candy coat it, but I know that I know that discomfort. And I know it's a signal of this is a good loop I'm about to do. This is an important loop. It's an uncomfortable loop. You know, what I heard and what sparked me was what I think Desiree, is that the woman's name?
Yeah, Desiree Adaway.
When you spoke Desiree's words about that level of inclusion, I could feel sparks in myself of no, but I couldn't include those people, or I could feel my own little reactions coming up. I now know that that's an invitation to activate my relatedness, my allyship with this liquid state, and to go into that discomfort, take that loop in the path of self-knowledge, of just exploring, oh, there's a trigger. Whew. And so I just wanted to mention that dynamic and that particular distinction, because it seems like a kind of universally useful kind of tool, if you will, that can be pretty easily taught. It doesn't mean that it's super easy to make it a familiar thing to do. Oh boy, I get to go feel like I'm going to throw up, But here we go. And to start to build a positive relational base with that state of being.
Yeah.
And then, God, if we're really lucky, we get to sit in circle with others who are in a similar state in that moment, in that situation, and to just explore that together and hold space for one another, for that level of discomfort, and that level of not knowing. I can feel a kind of a wobble in my system just as I slow down. I'm just feeling that right now. And to be able to hold space for each other in that wobble together, not know what the fuck to do, or really even how to be. That's a courageous state.
Yeah.
And
And we need courage, right? We
Yeah.
need courage, like what you're talking about is so important, is these, how do we become more courageous than we thought we could be, right? And I think the other thing you're talking about that I love is welcoming. It's the skill of welcoming.
Mhm.
So I work with a bunch of different groups, and at one point we were talking about welcoming in general. And as you know, and maybe some people know, but some people don't, one of the ways that Francis Weller talks about collapse is he calls it the long dark. And he basically says, we are in the long dark. We are deepening in the long dark. And
Mhm.
I love that language because it is invitational, right? It's a little easier to imagine being in the long dark than to imagine being in polycrisis, right? There's these ways, right? And both are fine. I actually think it's great to have a lot of different ways to say things. Some things will hit for
Yeah.
some people and not for others. But I love that kind of imaginative way of saying things. And I love what you're talking about like the water aspect, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So we were talking about the long dark, we were talking about welcoming, and this person in one of the groups wrote something that was like, can I be brave enough to welcome the long dark? And I think about it all the time in my throat as I say this, because I'm like, right, what would it mean if we welcomed the long dark? What would it mean if we were to say, I mean, this is happening, because it is. And how do we get more skillful at being in the dark together, at being with mystery, at being with what's really fucking confusing,
Yeah.
right? And how do we welcome that and almost say, like, I mean, here's for me, here's the beauty in that. If we look at things just through numbers, we're fucked, right? That's true. But if we look at things and we say, there's actually a mystery that we don't quite know. And we know this because, at least for me, we've all had moments in our lives where something happened that was so strange that you're like, something else had to have been playing a role there, right? Like you run into somebody 2,000 miles from where you actually met them in a scenario where you're like, that was weird, right? I actually have someone in my life right now that she's this amazing body worker. The amount that we have in common, the amount of people that we know, she actually lived in this house that I'm living in now. We did not know it. There's so many weird things that I'm like, that we're both like, something's happening there. Something's
Yeah.
happening there, right? And we've all had those experiences in small or large ways, right? So when we can start to say there's some mystery here that we have to start welcoming, and it's confusing and it's uncertain and it's uncomfortable,
Yep.
but I'm going to cultivate the courage to just sit with it. I actually think that's beautiful. And I think that's where some of the most beautiful and exciting things can come from,
Yes.
right? And in my own life, those are the things. I was just talking to a friend yesterday about someone in their life is in a very stuck place for I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening, and we've all been in that place. And I was like, that's valid. I want to be with that experience, with that person in that experience. And I also know that, like, one small thing can change, and it can all of a sudden open up doors that you didn't know were there,
Yeah.
right? And that's also the beauty of polycrisis in a way, is like, we actually don't know what weaving or mixture of these things could happen that could open a door,
Mhm.
you know? And
Mhm.
and I mean that in various ways. So just to say, like, I love what you're talking about around like welcoming as much as we can, right?
Mhm.
Welcoming aliveness, welcoming whatever experience is coming. For me, that change, I'm just telling you, there's something about that person saying, like, oh, you know what? I'm going to work on welcoming the long dark, where I was just like, yeah,
Yeah.
me too.
Yeah.
Me too, right? Like, let's start really practicing what that means. And PS, if we can practice the skill of welcoming each other, of
Mhm.
appreciating each other, it goes a long way. One of the things we were talking about in the beginning of this is the teams I work with, is one
Mhm.
of the teams you're familiar with. And people often will bring this up like, "Oh, that must be really beautiful." And I'm like, "It actually really is." Like,
Mhm.
but and the one of the biggest things I've learned from that team, from Francis, is just like taking the time to appreciate each other showing up, right? Taking the time to really welcome each other into the space.
Yep.
Taking the time to really like be in relationship and check in. Like, so many of our team meetings, half of it is just being like, "No, how are you?"
Yes.
Right? And welcoming whatever comes out of that. And so I love what you're saying, because I think it is one of the biggest skills that we're going to need, because the more we push it away, it's just not going to work, right? And there are things that need to die. Um let's say like big oil companies. There could be a couple of billionaires that I kind of feel like need to die, but like, so how do we help that happen? Right?
Yeah.
How do we actually usher some of these things that need to die, but like maybe in a compassionate way? That's that's my practices, you know?
Yes. So you've been kind of um, reinforcing or reflecting about liquid state and what some of the attributes of that. And I agree. I mean, it's been one of the most life-saving and life-enriching elements of my own practices since I was a teenager. That kind of simple phrase that I throw around a lot in my work, especially in the beginning courses and so on, is that we're uh, expanding our capacity to be present in the face of larger and larger stressors. And for me, being present includes what you so beautifully lay out for us about relatedness. It just includes it because what I've experienced in mostly in non-ordinary states, psychedelics and vision quests and so on, is that the relationship is the fabric of what we're in. It's implied, it's implicit, but it definitely needs to be named because our culture has so smashed it out of our awareness at any level. But it seems like those two elements are um, strong together. It's good that we've landed here with these two distinctions for the moment of being able to have an allyship with the liquid state, with that, leaning into that discomfort, leaning into that uncertainty, leaning into the truly open possibility. And then similarly with the openness to expand our capacity to be present in the face of a self-terminating culture that we have created and that we've been born into. They're both so, there's a rawness to each of those distinctions for me, and just how where I'm landing with what you've shared and what I'm sharing. Um, there's a sweet simplicity there uh, that I'm just appreciating at a new level uh, in this moment. So, Holly, you've been so generous with your time, and I I'm conscious of, being I don't want to take advantage of your generous nature with with your time. I'm wondering if you would share with us a bit of how is your work showing up? Given what you've shared, you've given us a great amount of background, all the way back years and decades, and all the way up into what you're very currently kind of founded in. How is that showing up? What is it that you are bringing? What's alive for you now in your work, and alive for you in terms of the circles, the people who want to work with you? I was kind of giggling a bit with you. I follow you on Instagram, and you've been recently asking for people's feedback. Like, what would you like more of? Because I offer some things out here, and I'm not quite sure what really rings for you folks. And so I'm wondering if you would share what's alive for you now, for yourself personally, and also for your work.
Yeah. Well, I am always pretty positively obsessed with community. And so one of the things that I'm just always working on and I'm currently working on is community building in different ways. I'm really interested in um, supporting, building land-based, community-centered sort of grief and soul sanctuaries. So that's something I'm mentoring me on that and putting some different proposals together. I'm actually in a space, I'm moving soon. I have to move for different reasons, and I'm pretty committed to trying to do that in a communal way, like
Hmm.
trying to yeah, I think we need more spaces of refuge. I
Mhm.
think we need more spaces where we can learn some of these skills.
Mhm.
Um, so that's kind of, I would say, like bigger picture, what I'm working on, both personally and professionally. I'll continue to do grief tending. I think it's such an important part of collapse work. I'm always going to continue to do sort of soul-based grief tending, ritual-based grief tending. I'm actually doing a 3-day grief ritual out in Salt Lake City with Aaron, Carl, and Alexandre in a couple weeks. I'm hoping to offer more of those. Oh, and actually next year, so it's going to be a 9-month offering, 6 months beforehand, 6 months online, and then a 5-day retreat that's around grief tending and hide tanning. So I work with a hide tanner, and really it's going to be a smaller group, but working with people who are doing grief tending, so people who are facilitating in some way and working with the hides as we do our own grief work, do a grief ritual, and then they'll leave with some vessels from the hides. Will make these kind of medicine pouches, these vessels that they'll get to take with them that will sort of represent their own vessel and how they want to care for that, as well as the medicine that they're carrying with them. And really like symbolic of how do we keep our vessels warm, both the ones we're tending and our own. So just to say, I mean, my work is really, I'm interested in how we get the on the ground skills that we need in these times. I've been kind of, um, how do I say this? I've been dipping my toes in or working a little bit more with like the politics of the moment we're in. And that's mostly, so for instance, I've been facilitating a white anti-racist somatic group for the last 3 years. Beautiful group. We meet every week. And both between that and some of the other groups I do, when the most recent Supreme Court decisions came out, uh, because I have a law background, I was like, I actually know how to read these fairly well. And I started to kind of put out some different information about what I was seeing and what I was reading, which PS, some of those Supreme Court decisions were the most concerning Supreme court decisions I have ever read. And I'm
Mhm.
saying that as someone who's read hundreds because I went to law school, I had to. So I'm pretty familiar with the lay of the land there. And uh, absolutely what's happening is they've already unrolled Project 2025, right? And they're
Yes.
already really dismantling so much of our government. And that's an ongoing project. You know, I posted something that said like Project 2025 is just the outcome of Project 1492, right? If we're not doing our grief work,
Yes.
that is the inevitable outcome, and that's true. But just to say, as these things have been unfolding and quickening, I've kind of started to do a little bit more political work than I had been, just sort of telling people like this is what I'm seeing. And within that, I think I'm probably going to open up some kind of collapse aware activist based network soon. People just keep asking me about it. And I'm interested in it. I'm interested, honestly, in what it is going to take to get people to stand in their fullest selves, to
Yeah.
stand with the courage that's needed to stand up against the predator, to stand up against the predatory systems, because it's going to take a whole hell of a lot. It's going to
Mhm.
take more than we ever thought it would. I know that.
Yeah.
And so, but I also know we can't do it alone. So I'm really interested in cultivating spaces where we can help people become people of potency and culture, where we can help people sort of have that juice that's needed to
Mhm.
stand in the face of really scary shit.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm working on a book. Um, and so I don't know, that seems like enough for now. That seems like quite a bit.
Yeah.
But it's always, I will say, my work will always be enveloped within community, and how do we continue to coalition and community with each other. And I mean that in like both sort of imaginative ways, but I also mean that in really sort of practical, like what are the rituals of rupture and repair that we have,
Yeah.
right? What are shared rhythms that we can cultivate? And like you said, what are the what are the simplest embodiment practices that
Mhm.
we can do with ourselves, but also with each other, which sometimes are just like laying on the ground and being
Yeah.
like, man, something intense is happening right now, right? So anyways, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it does answer the question. Yeah, thank you. Um, hmm. So I mentioned that back at the beginning of our conversation, I mentioned that there are really two audiences for this talk, and one group is going to be hearing and seeing this conversation soon. I'll have this up in the Poetry of Predicament podcast and also in the Mighty Networks space for living resilience. I'll have it up in a couple days, and they'll
Cool.
be able to. I'm hoping that you will send me an email full of links to be able to have people connect people up with you and your lovely team or teams and the events that are coming up soon, and to stay in touch with what that iterates into over the months and so on. There's also that second audience that's going to be far more specific. Each of the months of this year-long program has a theme or two. And of course, there will be a theme about grief it just on its own, and possibly, probably grief in combination with the other massive scale elements of the human experience that we have no idea how to metabolize, and that it is toxifying in every direction as it spins like a giant hurricane of unmetabolized uh, anti-life elements that we have founded our culture on. And so your voice, your contribution, your presence here in this conversation will be even more important there. And so I'm hoping you won't mind if I bug you in some number of months. And actually, it'll be sooner than later because I know you've got a booked out schedule. I'm going to be inviting you to come back for another conversation if you have space for it, and possibly a panel discussion about one of a couple of different threads that I've been tracking in our conversation today that I predict will be even more vitally important to dive into at the next level in just a few months. You
Yeah.
know, we're still in the acceleration and we're still in the intensification. So if you don't mind, I will be reaching out, and I understand if your dance card is full, your plate is full, whatever.
No,
But
I would love, let's get griefy together in a few months, right?
yeah,
I
yeah,
love,
exactly.
I'm happy to talk about grief in all different ways, and happy to talk about the six gates of grief, happy to talk about grief ritual. And
Yeah,
even, I think we both know the times we're in are going to get more intense. And
yeah,
part of what I know is going to happen is more violence, right? And here, I think, and I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I think we're headed into a pretty severe civil war here.
mm,
And I say that because, right, if Harris wins, there's going to be violence, right-wing violence. And if Trump wins, there's going to be violence. um, and so, anyways, I think there's going to be even more need for, but also even more need for grief work. So, always happy to kind of delve into that and really say, like, how do we do the grief work needed even when we're in really kind of violent times? Because that's what we're headed into.
yeah. And I think you remember when we first met and got to work together for a while. Yeah, I told you about how my major sense way of sensing out into the field is energetic, far before it's anything about the content or the news or the politics and so on. And in the energetic realm, it already has been even just far more violent than even in these past 5 years, in the pandemic, and we had riots and we had, massive expression. And October, what was the date of the insurrection and so on. The energetics of what's going on in terms of violence really humbles the stuff we see in the news. And so I'm with you. I look forward to our conversations, and just keep checking in, keep finding the simplest, most potent ways to fall back into relationship with one another
Well,
time
can
and
I
time again.
what I want to say about that is, while I totally agree that energetics are more violent, it's not looking good. I'll say that, right? It's scary. But I
Mhm.
also want to say, I work with groups of people every week, multiple groups. Some are 12, some are 200. And I just have to say, every week I am blown away by the way these people show up with
Mhm.
heart and courage. The shit they share.
Beautiful.
Like I'm like, it's so funny to me how humans can be both like the most annoying or horrible, but
Yeah.
also like the most beautiful. And the way I see them support each other, the way I see them show up for each other, the way I see them sharing, the the amount of heart. And some of these people have been through more than we could ever imagine. and they continue to show up that way. That's what gives me hope. And I know hope can be a real bad four-letter word in these circles.
Right.
And we
Uh,
we could spend a whole session talking about that because I actually find it fascinating. But I will say, like, there is so much beauty in
Yeah.
humans showing up for each other
Yes.
amidst what feels impossible. And I see it happen multiple times every week.
Yes.
Honestly, honestly.
Yeah. I so appreciate you really punctuating at the end of our time in conversation with this, because this is exactly what I'm pointing at when I say this work is about expanding our capacity to be present in the face of larger and larger stressors. To be present is to be in the presence of the implicit. It truly is the love before and after everything else. So it's exquisite that you brought that up. And I so thank you for that. It's such an important balance. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean it. I'm actually like kind of melancholic, slightly pessimistic person. There's a reason why I ended up in collapseware space, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It goes with my personality, but I really mean it when I say a lot of the people who just keep showing up. I'm blown away. I'm blown away. It's really is miraculous that people keep showing up with their hearts open. That's how I know miracles exist. That's
yeah,
how I know there's a chance, even though there's like maybe not a chance, you know?
yeah, yeah. It is such a joy to spend time with you. I miss you and I appreciate you. And I so look forward to staying connected in some way over these months and in the coming times. There's an urgency that we must slow down for, as the person you introduced me to, Bio, is now well known for saying. Holly Truhlar, it is a joy to have you here on the Poetry of Predicament. It's good. It's absolutely a privilege to have you in my life in a way that am. I feel so lucky to be able to call you my friend. And um, yeah, there's so much power and there's so much love and so much fierceness in you. So
Hmm.
I just yeah, just appreciate you and thank you so much for spending time with us all here. And I look forward to the next time.
Well, likewise, I'm so glad that we get to be friends and get to share some time and space in this life. So
Yeah,
thanks, Dean. Yeah.
yeah.
In